Letta Tayler is the senior terrorism and counterterrorism researcher at Human Rights Watch. Her focus includes the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, counterterrorism policy at the United Nations, drone strikes and other targeted killings, and measures in countries around the world on foreign ISIS suspects and family members. She's worked in more than 36 countries as a human rights defender and in a previous capacity as a journalist. In 2013, she wrote the report Between a Drone and Al-Qaeda, the civilian cost of US targeted killings in Yemen.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's an honor to join this event organized by Repatriate the Children Denmark. Groups like this are critical to persuading both home countries and the local authorities in Northeast Syria that they need to do everything possible to bring home these children. And we at HRW, Human Rights Watch, would argue it's critical that countries bring home the women and the men too. Human Rights Watch and I personally have been carrying out advocacy with a number of countries, Western countries around the world, to press them to bring home their nationals from Northeast Syria. Most recently, we sent a letter to 4 Nordic countries, including Denmark, urging them to repatriate their citizens as soon as possible. We very much look forward to engaging with Denmark and the other 3 Nordic countries, which are Finland, Norway, and Sweden, on this urgent issue. We have heard media reports just this week of a recent Zoom meeting between authorities from Denmark and other Western countries with the Northeast Syrian authorities who are holding these thousands of foreign nationals for suspected links to ISIS or for being their family members. We hope that this meeting is a sign of renewed movement to resolve the impasse on this crisis. Human Rights Watch calls on all those involved in these negotiations, and here I mean home countries, but also regional bodies like the European Union and the authorities in Northeast Syria, to do everything possible to swiftly and safely bring home these foreign nationals. We understand that these negotiations can be complex, but these vulnerable foreign nationals should not become victims of political maneuvering by any party responsible for their well-being. You may ask why the position of Human Rights Watch is that men and women should be brought home too. The answer is twofold. First, because family unity is an essential component of the rights of the child. In addition, the right to family life is an essential component of the European Convention on Human Rights. No child should be separated from their parent except in exceptional cases where it is clearly in their interest. Here you have a situation where these children are deeply traumatized, first by ISIS and now by living in these camps for 2 or more years. And their mother is perhaps the only person that they know and trust. To remove them from this situation and transport them home without their mother is only going to contribute, in most cases, perhaps not all, but in most cases, to their trauma. For this very reason, we laud Denmark's announcement last month that it intends to bring home 3 mothers along with their 14 children from Northeast Syria. This is a dramatic policy change, and we think it's a brave and important announcement, and we hope it is followed up with action swiftly. However, we are concerned that Denmark has also said that it will only bring home 5 of the other Danish children held in Northeast Syria if their mothers stay behind. Now, this is because the mothers of these particular 5 children have been stripped by Denmark of their citizenship. All are considered by Denmark to be dual nationals. But the proceedings in which their nationality was revoked are controversial. In addition, these 5 other Danish children whose mothers were stripped of their nationality should not have to be denied their right to family unity in order to exercise another fundamental right, which is to live in their country of nationality. So we urge the Danish authorities and all other countries who consider separating parents from children to consider both the legal consequences in terms of the violations of the rights of the child, but also the moral implications and what it means for trying to truly reintegrate these children into Denmark or other home countries. As for the adults, why should men and women without children be repatriated, you may ask? Well, one reason is accountability for horrific ISIS crimes. There are no trials in sight for foreign adults in northeast Syria right now. And while the Kurdish-led coalition that is detaining these nationals has called for help from foreign governments to conduct trials in accordance with international fair trial standards, so far the support has not been forthcoming. Not one of these detainees, and here I include not just the adults, but the children, have even been brought before a local judge to determine whether it's necessary and legal for them to be detained. This is a flagrant violation of international due process rights. And what it means is that any war criminals among the foreign nationals in northeast Syria are not being held to account for their despicable crimes. And here I'm not speaking necessarily about Danish citizens, because I am not in any position to opine on whether Danish citizens may or may not be guilty of any particular ISIS crimes. Many of them may not be. Some of them may be. I really don't know. That's not my role. But speaking broadly, failing to bring perpetrators of ISIS crimes to justice is an affront to the legions of ISIS victims. We have a situation here where there's no due process in northeast Syria. Perpetrators are not being held to account. And meanwhile, more than 27,000 foreign children are being indefinitely detained in what amounts to collective punishment for any acts committed by their parents. We recognize, turning to security issues, that bringing home all nationals is not an entirely risk-free endeavor. And we appreciate, we very much appreciate this fact. We recognize the response of governments to keep people on their territory safe. And we mourn the victims of terrorism in Denmark and everywhere else in the world. But Human Rights Watch is not saying that everyone suspected of a serious crime or being a security threat should simply go free. To be clear, we are calling for rehabilitation and reintegration of foreigners, but we're also calling for monitoring and prosecutions of adults as warranted. We think that in the long term, moreover, that the security risks are far greater of leaving these foreigners in northeast Syria than they are of bringing them home. Left in northeast Syria, they can break out of camps and prisons and go who knows where. And children can be recruited by ISIS or other extremist armed groups as they grow older. Indeed, I would argue that the longer Western European detainees remain held in horrific conditions with no due process, the more it fuels the narrative of ISIS that the West is willing to dispense with universal rights when it comes to Muslims. That is a very dangerous argument. Moreover, governments don't just have the responsibility to protect the people on their soil from harm, such as attacks by groups like ISIS. Governments also have a responsibility to protect their nationals abroad when they face serious violations of their rights, where these governments, in cases where the governments have the practical power to provide such protection. The serious violations that Danes and other foreigners face in northeast Syria include the loss of life and torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Let's just look at the camps for a moment, where the women and children are held behind locked gates and barbed wire, surrounded by armed guards. This is not a camp where foreigners move freely. They are prisoners for all practical purposes. Inside these camps, drinking water is frequently contaminated. I myself saw worms in the water in Al Hol camp. The detainees face food shortages, particularly of fresh food, acute shortages of medicine and medical help and other essential supplies. The latrines are overflowing. They're living in tents that leak in the rain, that blow over in the wind, and that catch fire from kerosene used for heating and cooking. Hundreds of camp detainees have died since 2019. And many of them are children, often in horrible accidents like tent fires or from preventable diseases. Others have been killed by alleged ISIS hardliners. Most children have no schooling. They have no games. They have no nationality. They have no sense of what their future will bring. And therefore, they have no hope. Women have told us of being held in horrific conditions in a camp jail or in local prisons elsewhere in northeast Syria when they try to escape or to break rules such as bans on possessing a cell phone. These are punishments in these cases, based on what we've heard, they are grossly disproportionate to the infractions or crimes that they may have committed. And particularly in cases of mothers, the mothers who are jailed, their children in these separate jails or prisons, their children are either brought with them to the prisons or camp jails, and the conditions there are much worse than they are even in the regular camp sections, or they're left in the camps to fend for themselves or to rely on help from adults and other children in the camps. This is only a situation that is only going to compound the trauma of these detainees. During 3 visits to Al Hol in June 2019, I was overwhelmed by not just the sights, but also the smells and sounds of suffering. Children coughing, wailing, lying still and sweaty, covered with flies and dust. Children gaunt with distended bellies, children with amputated limbs and crutches that were the wrong size, or in some cases, no crutches at all. Children playing half naked in the dirt with rocks as toys. Children staring vacantly, looking simply lost. Now, that was in June 2019, but aid workers and detainees tell me the situation remains horrific, including in some cases at Rouge Camp, which is supposed to be the newer, improved camp for detainees in contrast to the larger camp Al Hol. One foreign woman described the situation to me in a clipped text message in March. She wrote, "It never gets better here, always worse. Majority of the children in the camp are sick. Almost every day, something bad happens. Children trapped in burning tents and dies. We have water tank that contains worms. I want to go home." I heard this refrain, "I want to go home," over and over again during my visit and in subsequent conversations with detainees, or in letters forwarded to me, texts and other notices forwarded to me from their family members. Now, of course, I cannot vouch for the sincerity of all of these women, but many genuinely appeared broken, simply desperate to try to get back home, to restart their lives, make amends for any crimes they may have committed, and to give their children a future. We should not forget that several of these women are victims of trafficking themselves, either groomed or lured by ISIS to come over to Syria, sometimes even themselves as children, or in some cases brought by husbands, and they were afraid to say no. I'm not saying some didn't go voluntarily, of course, but there is a line between victim and perpetrator, and we have to be cognizant of that at all times. Some of these women are victims, others are perpetrators, others are both. But under international law and principles, victims of trafficking, even when they're perpetrators, should really be treated as victims. This is essential under principles for victims of trafficking. And as for the children, they're all victims, both of ISIS and now of the impasse in bringing them home. The prison conditions are even worse than in the camps. 700 or more boys are in these prisons along with men, including 300 or more foreigners. This is a growing population of boys because they are culled from the camps as they reach mid-adolescence, as most likely the UN Senior Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism will have noted in her own presentation for this event. These children are often snatched in the middle of the night from their tents where they were sleeping with their family members and brought to prisons where they have no more contact with their families. Some are also placed in a so-called rehabilitation center called the Hurry Center. But when I visited that center, I didn't find any rehabilitation going on. And the administrators of the center said that they were hard put to provide rehabilitation because they weren't getting enough money from foreign governments. This is to do so. The Kurdish-led authority in northeast Syria is strapped for cash, and they're fighting a war on multiple fronts. They do not have the resources of Western countries to help in rehabilitation programs. They desperately need help. So even in these situations, I would not call these rehabilitation centers something positive. It's warehousing of children. And when I spoke to these adolescent boys, they cried and trembled as they spoke about the traumas of being boys under ISIS, and in some cases being brought by their parents and told they were going on vacation and then suddenly finding themselves in Syria, having no idea that this is where they would be brought. But they cried and trembled even more when they talked about how they missed their mothers and their siblings, how they wanted to visit them, connect with them. So separating these boys from their siblings and their mothers and putting them someplace else, such as prisons or so-called rehabilitation, that's not rehabilitation. That's incarceration with no due process. And it's a clear violation of the rights of the child on multiple levels. Only 1 in the 14 prisons holding ISIS suspects is fit for purpose, according to a U.S. military report issued last summer. And hundreds have died in the prisons since 2019, including a small number of Europeans. At least we know of a small number, and there may well be more. I would like to add also that while there may be cases of physical torture, we don't know how many. We also consider that the conditions in the camps and prisons, in and of themselves, combined with indefinite and arbitrary detention, may well amount to torture on their own. Foreign donors are providing some aid for the camps in northeast Syria. And meanwhile, the United Kingdom and the US-led coalition against ISIS are reportedly looking at expanding or building more prisons, as well as so-called rehabilitation centers for adolescent boys. This is ostensibly to ease overcrowding and other inhuman conditions. And of course, we laud efforts to make conditions better. But let's be clear. Improving horrific conditions does not change the fact that indefinite detention without judicial review is unlawful. And expanding prisons and locked rehabilitation centers to warehouse hundreds of children who never chose to live under ISIS is unconscionable. So as I wrap up, I pose the question, what do we have here in northeast Syria? What we have is the risk. Unless countries move fast, we have the risk of it to repatriate. Unless countries move fast to repatriate, we have the risk of a new population of so-called forever prisoners, indefinitely held without charge. This is what prisoners are called who remain in Guantanamo. But in this case, this would be a Guantanamo in the desert of northeast Syria with thousands rather than hundreds of prisoners, and a majority of them young children. Governments that actively contribute to this unlawful, abusive, what I want to say is that governments that actively contribute to this abusive confinement may actually be complicit in these detainees' unlawful detention and their collective punishment. I ask, is this the legacy that Denmark and other countries that champion human rights and rule of law seek for themselves? I don't think so. I certainly hope not. Therefore, we commend governments that are moving swiftly on this issue. And even those that stalled, if they're moving now, that is fantastic. And we implore other governments to do the same. Let's bring these children home and the adults along with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Letta Tayler, and thank you for joining us online now. It's great to have the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. Now, you paint quite a dire picture of the conditions in the prison camps, also currently, actually. And that just, I want to ask you one question. Should the children be removed from their mothers if that's the only way out of the camps? Wouldn't that be a logical conclusion?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
It's fine, thank you.
Yes, it's such an honor to join this event, and I think it's so important. I do not think that the children should be removed without their mothers. I don't think that there is such an obstacle to bringing the mothers home as well, particularly in the case of countries such as Denmark, where the number of children is very small and the number of mothers is even smaller. This is a manageable problem for a country with the resources of Denmark, for example, and many, many other Western countries. As the Special Rapporteur on countering terrorism noted, look at Kazakhstan, and indeed look at many other Central Asian countries, which combined lack the resources of most single Western European or Nordic countries. So I really don't think that this is an issue to even explore. If some of these women are indeed security risks, they can be monitored, they can be investigated. If appropriate, they can be prosecuted. And if they need to serve time in jail or prison, then at least they're serving time in a jail or prison that meets international standards, and their children can visit with them unless it's clearly not in the best interests of the child to do so. Now, if there are cases where it is not in the best interest of the child to be with the parent, that needs to be determined and verified by independent experts on a case-by-case basis. So thank you for the question. I really don't see that this is an option that needs to be explored. Children should not be separated from their parents as a blanket policy.
I think what I'm trying to raise here is that in a lot of Western European countries, there's still very strong opinion against repatriating mothers and foreign fighters. Also here in Denmark, we have actually seen government make these bargains where mothers are basically accepting the removal of a child just to protect the child. But then I want to ask you another question. There seems to be sort of a standstill now. We have so many mothers, children still in the Syrian prison camps. How do you see a solution out of this? There's not the political will here in Denmark just to take them home tomorrow.
Well, I think time will tell. We're seeing quite a lot of movement actually recently. We don't know if this is just if the discussions that have been underway even just this month between Western countries and the Northeast Syrian authorities are simply more dialogue that will lead nowhere, but at least the discussions are continuing. And I think this is significant. And we are seeing repatriations. We saw some repatriations just the other day or week to the Netherlands, for example. The announcement by Denmark that it is now considering repatriation of most mothers and all the children. I mean, as I noted in my pre-recorded talk, there is still the issue of these children whose mothers are stripped of citizenship. But the fact that Denmark has made this move, this policy announcement, I think is in and of itself significant. Of course, time will tell what happens, but I don't think we should consider this an entire impasse. And that's why it's really important that all of us who care about this issue continue to press, continue to engage with governments on why it is important that they do the right thing here. As Fionnuala Nialan said just now, this a la carte approach that we're seeing now is extremely dangerous, not only for the victims of the particular country adopting an a la carte approach, but to the world at large. It sends this perilous signal that it's okay to be selective about rights that are really universal. And if I may just take the opportunity, I wanted to center in on your question about opposition to, quote, foreign fighters. Now, this term is being used as if all the men and perhaps some of the women are all foreign fighters. Well, who is a foreigner and who is a fighter and who is a terrorist? There's no definition in international law. for who is a terrorist and who is a fighter. And as we've seen with some of the citizenship revocations, there's a big question as to who really is a foreigner and how they qualify. So I think we need to be very careful with these terms. Let's not forget that not one of these individuals in northeast Syria has been prosecuted locally. Now, some have been tried or charged by their home countries in absentia, but that's not the same thing. So the terminology is very important here because it's laden. And yes, some of these individuals may well be fighters, and some may well be war criminals, and some of them may well have participated in atrocious acts that I think all of us would agree are acts of terrorism. But not all are. Some may be cooks, some may be cleaners, and perhaps the punishment, if any, that they deserve for being cooks or cleaners is quite different than that. I hope that it's quite different than the punishment that of course someone merits for carrying out a war crime.
Though we are seeing progress in some countries bringing back citizens, other countries seem to do very little. So I acknowledge that you see progress, but when will Kurdish authorities be able to shut down Al-Hol and Lorsch? When will the camps be able to?
I don't want to overstate my optimism. I'd say that the progress has been marginal, but it's still heartening to see that there is some. I think it's important to note also that the negotiations have been hard on both sides. I mean, we have heard reports from some countries, and I'm not at liberty to say which, but some countries have expressed concern that the demands of the Kurdish-led authorities are unreasonable in their view. Now, I'm not in a position, without knowing the details, to know if the demands are unreasonable or not. But I think it's very important that all parties work together here. So, for example, the Kurdish-led authorities, if they're making demands, what are they? Individuals who are victims in particular should not be held, but all individuals should not be held hostage to some kind of negotiation, some kind of quid pro quo that has nothing to do with their rights. So I think it's really important that we all advocate, we engage constructively with all parties, and this includes the Kurdish-led coalition, and it also includes blocs like the European Union and the United Nations, where we're seeing a battle going on right now over the word repatriation in negotiations to renew the so-called UN Global it's not so-called, excuse me, the formal name is the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Now, this strategy says that human rights are one of the 4 pillars of an effective counterterrorism policy. It's the UN's blueprint for addressing groups like ISIS, for countering them. And yet, many Western countries do not even want the word repatriation in this renewing resolution for the global counterterrorism strategy. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think the first step toward ensuring that this impasse ends is bringing everybody to the table and putting aside the political demands. I also think that the task force in Denmark was quite an effective vehicle, from what I understand, in bringing in moving the government forward on the repatriations issue. So I think that similar task forces with a broad coalition of participants and security experts in the mix can really help as well.
Letta Tayler, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much.